The Nikon Z50 Mark II is truly one of the cameras ever made. Nikon, or Nikon, claims that this is a much higher quality and more convenient option to shoot photos and videos rather than just using your phone. So I put that to the test and got some interesting results. Dial it in, boys. This video is sponsored by Tarion. Guys, we have a package in the mail and I don't know who it's from. Let's go check. Come on, Uncle Joe. Willow, you're a good girl. Mother load. I really want to slide this down the stairs.
You want to try it?
I think this week we start out with Uncle Joe unboxing.
No way.
He's good with a knife.
I would love to.
It's a live tree. This Tarion Titan rig is what I'm using to film all of my talking head videos moving forward. It comes with every single accessory you would ever need to mount a light, a microphone, a camera, a monitor to view your camera's image, a laptop or an iPad, and a beefy audio recorder. They also have this desktop camera mount that I'll be using as well. Dude. Still holds. This could be great for live streaming, video games, or just a unique angle over your monitors, or just mounting in uncomfortable positions where it's usually hard to put a tripod. Their gear is seriously high quality, but it's also very affordable. So please check out the link below. It directly supports me and my family if you just go and browse some items. Thank you for the sponsor, Tarion. Now on with the Z52 shenanigans. Okay, so what is the Z50 Mark II? Let's give a little bit of context really quick. Basically, this is a crop sensor Nikon mirrorless Z-mount camera that they're boasting is a great replacement for your phone in terms of shooting photo and video, which I can totally understand because I don't really like shooting photo and video on my iPhone, even though it's absolutely the most convenient camera I've ever owned. But I could also see this being tailored toward beginners who want to get into photography or video, or maybe a more seasoned shooter that just needs a backup camera or a C camera. And we're gonna put those claims to the test for sure. This camera, body alone, is just $960, which I know is still kind of expensive if you're getting your very first camera. But in terms of mirrorless cameras that shoot 4K, high quality log footage up to 60 frames per second and 20 megapixel photos, it doesn't really seem bad on paper, but again, we'll test it. Okay, so let's talk about the outside of the camera, the physical body itself. This is the first pro for me because it honestly feels really good, similar to the Z6 III, which is their new full frame mirrorless flagship that's geared more toward video, but also great at photos. And it just has that same rugged style body, even though it's ultra compact, but it also has a decent amount of grip as well on the handle here, which is very cool. But it's so tiny, I was able to easily fit it into my pocket to go downtown Indianapolis for some street photography tests. That alone is just awesome. I love APS-C cameras because they're so tiny.
Just rizzing off on all of my haters. How you doing today?
It does shoot 20 megapixel photos, but it has the exact same DX sensor as the first Z50, which is kind of interesting, and I think it leads to some of the serious problems I have with this camera, although it does have a newer processor. Kind of reminds me of another company and how they handle products with minor upgrades. It does have a Z mount on the front, so it's gonna have access to all of their newest lenses. Their full frame ones will work on this. Obviously it'll have more of a crop because it's crop sensor, but the best thing is you can use crop sensor lenses, which are usually way more affordable and way smaller. I've been using the Nikon 24mm 1.7, the Sigma 16mm 1.4. I absolutely love that lens, and the Sigma 56mm 1.4, I think. Those lenses in combination are just freaking awesome. This camera just has one single card slot. It's not abnormal for an affordable camera like that, but just keep it in mind. For ports, it has a micro HDMI. Oof sound effect, please. I don't expect a small camera like this to have full-size HDMI, but micro is just a pain in the butt and it can break your ports so easily. So if you're planning on using HDMI for an external monitor or something, I'd probably just invest in a cage to put around this camera. But we're gonna see if I even recommend this camera in general later on, so stick around. It does have a USB-C port with with power delivery and webcam functionality, which is something I think all cameras need to have. It's amazing. So you can just plug this into your computer, and programs like OBS, FaceTime, Zoom, those types of things will automatically recognize this as a webcam source. So your Zoom calls and business meetings will look so much better right out of the box. It also has a headphone jack, a microphone jack, and a hot shoe with flash sync. Something I love about the body is it has a flip screen, but it also has an EVF. We've been talking on this channel about a weird trend in cameras not having viewfinders anymore, affordable cameras, and I love that they made this camera so compact, but gave you a flip screen if you want to do video stuff, but also gave you an EVF if you want to do photography stuff. Love that. Let's keep that going. And the camera also boots on very fast. Speaking of photography, let's talk about the overall photo performance of the Z52. Z52, yeah. It does have a mechanical shutter and the option to use electronic shutter for silent modes if you're a funeral photographer or something like that. But one thing I don't like is that the shutter speed maxes out at 1/4000th of a second. I would have loved to see it go up to 8000 for those really bright situations outside where you still want to have a shallow depth of field. Now, autofocus for photography is different than autofocus for video. So we're gonna start with photo, and it's honestly pretty good. I put it through a scenario where I was having my dog run toward me out in a field, and it was a bright day. There's plenty of light for this camera to recognize my dog as a subject, and it does have animal recognition. We'll get to that as well in a second. But even in the burst mode, I noticed that it missed quite a few shots, and I also tested it by just firing off JPEGs. I know, don't click off yet, but it definitely captured more JPEGs in focus in burst mode with continuous focus, and I'm guessing that's because it's pushing the camera's processor less. It's not working so hard. But even in RAW, it did capture some good moments throughout the burst of my dog running toward me. I just wouldn't rely on it or consider it like a professional level of burst autofocus, which I know we could say like, don't expect that from a camera like this, but you're spending about $1,000 on a camera that some people are probably planning on using for their kids' sporting events and stuff like that. You need the autofocus to be dialed in. And I don't think it's an excuse for how affordable a camera is to not have amazing autofocus today, because there are other companies out there like Sony and Canon who are making affordable cameras as well that have really freaking good autofocus. So I hope to see this improved in the future for sure. Now let's talk about the weird stabilization settings in this camera. Basically, if you're using certain lenses that are compatible, then this camera gets your normal Nikon professional stabilization modes like normal, sport. But if you're using a third-party lens, which I prefer to use, I love Sigma lenses, then you don't get access to that better stabilization. You just get their electronic stabilization, which in photography isn't that bad. In video, it's
a different story.
That leads us nicely into the video performance of this little guy. I'm gonna need some coffee to get through this section. Let's start out with a good thing, because there's a lot of things I'm not stoked about. Okay, one awesome thing though is that this camera does have 8-bit and 10-bit internal shooting options. You can actually shoot in 4K up to 60 frames per second with an asterisk in Nikon's N-Log profile, 10-bit colors. It's pretty slick actually that you can shoot such a cool profile on such a tiny camera. And I love the ability to shoot in 60 FPS in 4K, but it has a massive crop. And also you don't get access to stabilization when shooting in 4K 60. And shooting in N-Log was actually surprising to me how good the profile looked from such a small camera. It's not probably as clean as their Z8, which I love the footage from that camera, but this is surprising for how tiny it is. Using N-Log in 4K, I was getting some frames that I feel like looked like a little Christmas commercial. It made me so happy. The ISO noise performance is actually pretty solid, up to 3200, and I probably wouldn't go farther than that if possible. Use lights if you can with any camera, no matter how good the low light performance is, but it's nice that you can get pretty good performance out of a small sensor camera like this. Okay, now let's address video autofocus. This is interesting. I actually discovered something about Nikon's autofocus that I like over other big brands like Sony and Canon and Lumix. This camera is able to auto-detect subjects for autofocus settings. For instance, if I'm outside and I'm filming my wife, and then I turn the camera and my dog is there, if I have that auto selection setting on, it will change from human to animal recognition back and forth. I think Sony and Canon also give you the option to change subject modes, but those autofocus systems are honestly so good at this point that you can kind of just point the camera in human detect mode, and it will most likely focus on something. It might not get the animal's eye or the front bumper of a car, but it's still most likely gonna have that object or subject in focus. And that's kind of the most important thing about autofocus, is the focusing. This camera honestly does a pretty good job with the Nikon native lenses and the third-party Sigmas. It's not perfect, it's not as good as Sony, I don't think, but it still kind of holds its weight. It does a relatively decent job. It doesn't look like it's constantly locked on and smoothly, kind of humanly focusing, but it pretty much holds a subject. Once in a while it gets wonky. The stabilization in video is the same story as photos. If you're using certain lenses, you only get access to the electronic stabilization, and it honestly looks really bad. Like, even if you're standing still, it just makes the footage look like you put Premiere's warp stabilizer on it, but you used like 10% too much, and it's always kind of skewed and jittery. It's very strange. And if you have electronic turned off, the camera is so lightweight that it just shows you all the micro jitters from your hands moving anyways. So you're kind of out of luck in both situations. Look at that electronic stabilization. So wonky. I move the camera a little bit and then the stabilization tries to catch up. And I don't see people wanting to rig this camera out to be massive to get rid of micro jitters anyway, because there's another problem. This camera has pretty bad rolling shutter. Even when you're just kind of slightly moving the camera around, you're gonna see some jello effects, and the footage just doesn't feel organic. It has that cheap quality to it in terms of motion. The actual image itself with N-Log and just how it looks with the 10-bit colors and whatnot looks fine, but the motion of the footage and the fact that it's so shaky and the electronic stabilization makes the footage look even worse and way more cropped in is just kind of a bit of a mess. Kind of a bit of a mess, kind of a bit of a mess. Now, a couple other quick tips about this camera is it does kind of have doo-doo cheeks battery life. It's not horrible, but it's definitely not great. I wish they would have put the bigger batteries from their full frame cameras into this camera. That would have been a more worthy upgrade than the Z51 to the Z52. It would have made this thing seem more significant for sure. So overall thoughts, technically the Z50 Mark II does what Nikon claims by giving you higher quality photos and videos versus just using your phone. But it doesn't do it with excellence, at least in terms of shooting video. For photography, this camera is solid for both beginners or more seasoned shooters that love Nikon's raw files that just have a natural look to them that they can edit and post. So is it actually worth the money? I don't think so. Actually, I think you could try something like the Canon R50. It's more affordable, and for a little bit more money, you could invest in the Sony a6700, which we just reviewed recently, and that camera is an absolute monster crop sensor camera that honestly makes full frame seem like a dumb decision in a lot of ways. So if you're interested in checking out a banger crop sensor camera, go watch this video right here. Support on Patreon to get your name on all my videos, free monthly gear giveaways, free presets from the past ones I've made to the future ones I will make. Join the Discord for some nerdy friends. Watch out for deer. Text me when you get home so I know you're safe. And you guys are loved much more than you might know. God bless you guys. See you in the next one.
Sponsored by Tarion.
That's what I thought. Bro, let's watch that.